In the stillness of an evening, when the world outside quiets down and the day's rush seems like a distant echo, history has a way of speaking softly. It is never loud, never demanding. It is more like a gentle stream that winds through forgotten valleys, carrying with it the stories of those who came before us. Tonight, I want to take you through one of those quiet journeys, a path not filled with wars and conquests, not with booming voices of politics or kings, but with the quieter realities of life that shaped the world we know today. This is not the kind of history that appears on school exams. This is the history that breathes in the silence of old letters, in the foundations of wooden homes, in the long-forgotten footprints on soil that has since been built over. If you close your eyes, imagine the year is somewhere in the early 1600s. The Atlantic Ocean lies stretched and endless, its waters dark, uncertain, and threatening. On its waves, wooden ships creak and sway, carrying men and women from Europe, heading westward into an unknown land. These people are not adventurers in the sense of glory seekers. They are survivors, dreamers, ordinary men and women leaving behind everything they knew because they believed in the possibility of something better. They could not know what awaited them: hunger, disease, bitter winters, and sometimes the hostility of a land they did not yet understand. But still, they came. Among the earliest settlements in what would become the United States was a place known as Jamestown, founded in 1607. When we think about it now, the image that often comes to mind is of brave settlers setting up camp, planting crops, and starting new lives. But the truth was far harsher. That small group of settlers, barely more than 100 at first, arrived in a land where nothing was prepared for them. The soil resisted their efforts. The winters bit deeper than they had expected, and food, the most essential thing, quickly became their greatest challenge. Many starved, many more fell ill. If you walked among them in those early months, you would not have seen courage etched clearly on their faces. You would have seen hunger, fear, and uncertainty. Yet somehow, they endured. The story of survival in Jamestown is not only about Europeans who arrived, but also about the people who were already there, the Powhatan tribes. Their world had existed long before ships crossed the Atlantic. They knew the rivers, the seasons, the forests. To them, this land was not new. It was home. Imagine the contrast. One group seeing endless possibility, the other group seeing strangers arrive who would disrupt everything they had known. For a time, the two groups exchanged knowledge: corn, beans, tobacco. These became lifelines for the newcomers. But as history so often teaches us, cooperation did not last. Suspicion grew and conflict followed. What is fascinating, when you step back and let the noise of conflict quiet down, is that in these first fragile years, a foundation was laid. A small settlement of weary settlers with failing crops and fragile hope somehow managed to keep going. They kept building, they kept planting, and though many died, some survived. That fragile beginning was enough for others to follow. And from it, the long, complicated story of what would become the United States began to take shape. Let's pause here and imagine life in those days, not as a textbook, but as a lived experience. Picture waking each morning with the sun, your breath visible in the cold air of winter, your stomach aching from hunger because the stores of grain are running low. Each creak of the wooden cabin around you is both comforting and worrying, because the walls feel too thin to hold back the world outside. You hear the sound of the river in the distance, and beyond that, forests that seem endless. Every sound in the night could be danger, or it could simply be the wilderness reminding you that you are far from the world you once knew. Life is fragile. The margin between survival and death is razor thin. Yet people keep trying. They keep planting seeds, building fires, and telling themselves that tomorrow will be better. And this is where history becomes more than facts. It becomes a reminder of what it means to endure. Because though the settlers of Jamestown may have been strangers to us, Their struggle was one we all recognize, the human will to keep moving forward, even when the future is uncertain. But Jamestown was not alone. Not long after, in 1620, another group set sail, the Pilgrims aboard the Mayflower. Their story has often been romanticized into a tale of thanksgiving and friendship. But if we look closer, we find another story of hardship, of choices made in desperation. They had intended to land in Virginia, but storms carried them off course, and they found themselves far to the north, in the rocky soil of what would become Massachusetts. Again, picture it. Exhausted travelers stepping off a battered ship, their clothes worn from months at sea, the air colder than they had ever imagined, the ground hard and unwelcoming. Yet here too they built, they prayed, they planted, they buried their dead, and kept going. The first winter was devastating. Half of them did not survive. Those who lived did so because of the help of the Wampanoag people, who taught them how to fish the waters and grow crops suited to the land. History remembers this as the first Thanksgiving. But behind that single day of shared food lies months of desperation, sickness, and the kind of hope that flickers only faintly before growing stronger. If you trace your finger across those years on a timeline, what you see is not the grand story of a powerful nation rising quickly. You see small dots of fragile communities, barely holding on, separated by miles of wilderness. Each was an island of human effort in a vast, unknown world. And yet, those fragile islands endured long enough to connect, to grow, and to multiply. When we tell these stories now, centuries later, it is easy to forget the silence that filled most of their days. Life then was not a series of dramatic events. It was slow, ordinary, and often painfully repetitive. Cutting wood, carrying water, watching the fire so it did not die out in the night, hoping the seeds would sprout, nursing the sick, comforting the grieving, and somehow, all of those ordinary moments strung together into something extraordinary. The survival of communities that should not, by all odds, have survived. The beginning of America, then, was not the fireworks of revolution or the speeches of great men. It was the quiet, fragile determination of people who refused to give up, even when everything around them told them they should. And as the night deepens around us, as we let the calmness of this story settle in, we begin to understand. History is not only the grand events written in bold. Sometimes, history is the quiet endurance of ordinary people who believed in tomorrow. The story of America's beginnings does not stop at Jamestown or Plymouth. Those fragile seeds of settlement, planted in cold soil and watered with uncertainty, soon began to take root. What started as a scattering of wooden huts and weary souls along the Atlantic coast slowly grew into something more. Small towns, churches, farms, and communities that, without realizing it, were laying the groundwork for a nation. If you try to imagine the map of New England in the mid-1600s, it would not look like the busy clusters of cities we know today. It would look like pockets of life, little clearings carved out of endless forest, each settlement separated by miles of wilderness and silence. The settlers came for many reasons. Some sought freedom to worship in their own way, away from the strict rules of the Church of England. Others came simply because they dreamed of owning land, something impossible for many in crowded European towns. Land was the great promise of the New World, though in reality it was never empty. It had long been lived on, hunted, and cultivated by native peoples. Yet for the settlers, it appeared as opportunity. Life in these new towns was not easy. Imagine a small wooden meeting house at the center, its roof pitched steeply to keep away heavy snows. Around it stood a few narrow houses built of rough timber, smoke rising gently from stone chimneys. Beyond the houses stretched fields of corn and wheat, small patches of tilled soil surrounded by thick forest. The forest was both a blessing and a threat. It provided wood for houses and fires, But it also sheltered animals they feared and people they did not fully understand. At night, when the wind blew through the trees, the sound could feel endless. The rhythm of daily life was simple, but demanding. Families rose before the sun, tending to animals and fields, chopping wood, hauling water from nearby rivers or wells. Children helped where they could, feeding chickens, gathering herbs, spinning wool. Women managed the homes, often working from dawn until dark, preparing meals, making clothes, and caring for children. Men spent long hours in the fields or at workshops, building tools, mending fences, and struggling to grow enough food for the long winters. Leisure was rare, and every day was a balance between survival and faith. Faith was at the center of these early communities. In towns like Salem, Boston, and Plymouth, religion shaped daily life. On Sundays, the entire settlement gathered at the meeting house. The sermons were long, sometimes lasting several hours, delivered in plain wooden buildings without decoration. The message was often the same. Life was a test, hardship was a trial, and endurance was a sign of faith. For the settlers, every failure of crops, every illness, every harsh winter was a reminder that their lives were fragile and that their future depended on both their labor and their belief in God's guidance. But alongside this faith, there was also fear. These early towns were haunted by uncertainty. Disease could spread quickly in close quarters. A poor harvest could mean hunger by winter. Tensions with native tribes could erupt into violence, fueled by misunderstanding, broken agreements, or simple desperation. To live in a New England settlement was to live with the constant awareness that the world beyond the village fence was larger and more dangerous than anyone could fully control. And yet, despite this fear, communities grew. By the mid-1600s, ships carried more families across the Atlantic, filling towns with new voices, new hopes, and new challenges. Boston, founded in 1630, became one of the first centers of trade and learning. Here, the wooden docks bustled with fishermen bringing in their catch, traders loading barrels of salted cod, and merchants speaking in many tongues. The harbor smelled of tar, salt, and smoke, a reminder that even in these early years, America was already tied to the wider world. Goods flowed in from Europe, cloth, tools, books, while barrels of fish, timber, and furs traveled back across the ocean. Still, the heart of life was not in the ports, but in the homes and farms scattered across the countryside. If you were to walk through a settlement in the evening, you might hear the sound of a fiddle being played softly by the fire, or the low murmur of prayers before bed. You would smell bread baking, or stew simmering over a hearth. Life was not without joy. Weddings were celebrated with dances and songs. Harvests, when successful, brought moments of feasting. Children played simple games with stones and sticks, their laughter carrying across the fields. In these moments, the settlers must have felt that their sacrifices were worth it, that from the wilderness, a new home was truly being made. But history is never only about peace. In the late 1600s, New England also saw darker chapters. Fear and superstition sometimes overwhelmed reason. One of the most haunting examples was the Salem witch trials of 1692. In a small Puritan town, whispers and accusations spread like wildfire. Neighbors accused neighbors of witchcraft, claiming strange illnesses or bad harvests were caused by unseen forces. Dozens were arrested. Some were executed. It was a time when fear of the unknown, combined with rigid belief, tore communities apart. And yet, even this tragedy became part of the fabric of early America, a reminder that fear, when left unchecked, can destroy even the bonds of neighbors. Despite such shadows, the settlements endured and expanded. By the end of the 1600s, New England was no longer just a fragile scattering of huts. It was a growing network of towns connected by dirt roads and trade routes. Wooden bridges crossed rivers, fields stretched wider, small schools opened, teaching children to read, often so they could study the Bible. Harvard College, founded in 1636, stood as one of the earliest symbols that education mattered even in a harsh new world. These communities, still vulnerable, were slowly becoming permanent. And through all of this, the struggles, the fears, the small joys, history moved quietly forward. When we think about the United States today, it is easy to see skyscrapers, highways, and technology. But beneath all of that lies this beginning. Families rising before dawn to milk cows, neighbors gathering to raise the walls of a new house, children carrying buckets of water from a well. These simple acts of endurance were the foundation. If you close your eyes and let yourself drift into that world, you can almost hear it. The creak of wagon wheels on a dirt road, the rhythm of an axe against wood, the voices of children practicing their letters by firelight. You can feel the rough wool of clothing, the chill of winter air slipping through cracks in wooden walls, the relief of warm bread after a long day. This was not an easy life, but it was a life that mattered. It was a life that slowly, quietly, carved out the beginnings of a nation. And perhaps the most striking thing is this: the people who lived these lives did not know they were making history. They were simply trying to survive, to raise families, to find meaning in a land both beautiful and unforgiving. They could not imagine the future that would grow from their efforts. But we, looking back now, can see how every nail hammered into a beam, every seed planted in rocky soil, every prayer whispered in the cold night added up to something far greater than they ever knew. This is the calm truth of history, that the beginnings of America were not loud or sudden, but steady and fragile, carried forward by ordinary people who lived and endured. Their world was smaller, quieter, harsher, but it was also the soil from which everything else would grow. As the 1700s unfolded, the scattered colonies along the Atlantic coast were no longer fragile experiments of survival. The huts had become homes, the villages had become towns, and the towns had begun to stretch into something more permanent. If you could have sailed along the coast in those years, you would have seen harbors bustling with ships, fields spreading farther into the countryside, and churches with their bells ringing across the mornings. The colonies had grown, and though they were still tied to England by law and trade, they had begun to develop a life of their own. By the early 18th century, there were 13 colonies established along the coast, stretching from New England in the north down to Georgia in the south. Each had its own personality, shaped by the people who lived there, the land they cultivated, and the traditions they carried. In New England, towns were clustered tightly together, built around churches and schools, where life was shaped by faith and community responsibility. In the middle colonies, places like New York and Pennsylvania, life was more diverse. People of different religions and languages lived side by side: Dutch, English, Germans, Quakers, and many others. To the south, the colonies of Virginia, the Carolinas, and Georgia became places of sprawling plantations with tobacco, rice, and indigo fields stretching as far as the eye could see. But behind this growth was a darker reality. Enslaved Africans were being brought across the ocean in ever greater numbers. By the 1700s, slavery had become a permanent part of colonial life, especially in the South. Ships carried men, women, and children against their will, forced into a brutal system that treated them as property. They worked the fields, cooked the meals, built the homes, and endured lives of hardship and violence. Even as colonists spoke of freedom and opportunity, that freedom was built on the suffering of others. History cannot be told without this truth, because it shaped the very foundations of America. In the northern towns, life took a different rhythm. Families often lived close together, and schools became a central part of community life. Education mattered, not only for religious reasons, but also for civic life. Children learned to read and write, not in grand buildings, but in small one-room schoolhouses with wooden benches and a single teacher. Imagine the smell of chalk dust and ink, the sound of lessons recited aloud by children who spoke with accents inherited from England but softened by the New World. For them, the colonies were no longer an experiment. They were simply home. Trade became the lifeline of the colonies. Harbors like Boston, New York, and Philadelphia grew into hubs of activity. Ships brought molasses, sugar, and rum from the Caribbean, textiles and manufactured goods from England, and carried back lumber, furs, fish, and tobacco. The sound of hammers in shipyards, the call of merchants bargaining in markets, the creak of wagons on cobblestones, all of these were the background music of a growing society. Philadelphia, in particular, stood out. By the mid-1700s, it was one of the largest cities in North America, with wide streets, stone houses, and a spirit of tolerance rare for its time. Founded by William Penn, a Quaker who believed in religious freedom, Pennsylvania became a place where different faiths could coexist more peacefully. Imagine walking through Philadelphia's streets. You would hear English, Dutch, German, and French spoken, see men in plain Quaker dress beside merchants in fine coats, and smell bread baking in ovens alongside the sharp scent of tanned leather from workshops. This variety gave the middle colonies a reputation for openness and opportunity. And yet, the colonies were not without tension. Even as they prospered, they were constantly reminded that they were not independent. England controlled trade through laws like the Navigation Acts, which required colonial goods to flow through British ships and ports. Taxes and regulations began to creep into daily life, small at first but always felt. The colonists were expected to see themselves as subjects of the British Crown. But with each generation born on American soil, that identity grew weaker. To a child born in Boston or Virginia in 1720, England was not home. America was. Daily life in the colonies carried on with a mixture of hardship and joy. On farms, families rose with the sun, tending to livestock, plowing fields, and preserving food for the winter. In towns, apprentices worked under blacksmiths, cobblers, or printers, learning trades that would support them for life. Taverns became centers of conversation, where travelers shared news, ideas, and stories from far-off places. In these dimly lit rooms, warmed by firelight, men argued about crops, politics, and the latest word from London. The seeds of debate, of questioning authority, were planted here as much as in the halls of government. But for most people, life was quiet, steady, and centered around family and community. Weddings were celebrated with dances. Harvest festivals brought moments of cheer. And even in hardship, people found reasons to gather. Music, often played on fiddles and flutes, echoed through barns during celebrations. Stories, passed down by firelight, kept history alive for children who had never seen the old world their parents had left behind. By the mid-1700s, a new generation of colonists had grown up knowing only America. Their parents or grandparents might have crossed the ocean, but they themselves had tilled the soil, built the homes, and laid the roads. Their voices carried not the accents of England, but a blended rhythm shaped by the land they lived on. They began to see themselves as different, not fully English, not yet independent, but something in between. Conflict, however, was never far away. The colonies existed on land that was still home to countless native tribes. As settlers pushed westward, building farms and towns, clashes became more frequent. Treaties were made and broken. Wars erupted, some small, some large, as cultures collided and survival instincts flared. The most significant of these would come in the mid-1700s. The French and Indian War, part of a larger struggle between European empires. But long before the cannons fired, the tension simmered quietly in the forests and along the frontiers. And still, daily life carried on. In Virginia, planters walked the rows of their tobacco fields, calculating profits and losses. In New England, Ministers preached to congregations about duty and morality. In the middle colonies, merchants drew up ledgers in careful script by candlelight, recording every barrel and crate that passed through their hands. History was not lived in grand speeches, but in the ordinary acts of people who woke each day to work, to struggle, and to hope. If you could step into that world for a single day, you might notice the mix of old and new. A farmer in Massachusetts might carry a Bible printed in London, but he read it by the light of a lantern made in Boston. A woman in Philadelphia might bake bread using wheat grown in Pennsylvania, but served it on a plate imported from England. A child in Virginia might wear homespun clothes, but dream of the stories told about London's grand streets. The colonies were both deeply tied to the Old World and slowly shaping a new one. This was America in the early 1700s, not yet independent, not yet powerful, but steadily becoming something distinct. 13 colonies, each with its own struggles, its own culture, its own rhythms of life, were quietly building the framework of a nation they did not yet know they were creating. And perhaps the calmest truth of all is this: the people living in those years were not rushing toward revolution or greatness. They were simply living, raising families, plowing fields, tending shops, gathering for worship, and telling stories by the fire. They did not know that history would remember them as the foundation of a country. They only knew that the sun rose, the work waited, and life had to be lived, one day at a time. By the middle of the 18th century, the 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast had matured into a complex living society. They were no longer fragile outposts struggling merely to survive winters and plant harvests. They were thriving in many ways: bustling ports, busy markets, thriving farms, and growing towns where generations had been born who had never seen the shores of England. Yet beneath this surface of growth, new challenges were stirring. Challenges that would eventually reshape the bond between the colonies and the British Crown. One of the greatest turning points of this era came with what is now remembered as the French and Indian War, fought from 1754 to 1763. To the colonists, it was another hardship in a line of many, but in reality, it was far more than that. It was the spark that began to change their relationship with Britain forever. At its heart, the war was about control. Control of land, trade, and power in North America. France had long claimed vast territories stretching from Canada, down the Mississippi River Valley, and into the interior of the continent. Britain, meanwhile, had established the 13 colonies along the Atlantic, but wanted to expand westward into the Ohio River Valley. For native tribes, these lands were home, and they were drawn, sometimes by choice, sometimes by necessity, into the rivalries of European empires. The result was a conflict fought not only on battlefields, but in forests, rivers, and villages scattered across the vast wilderness. Imagine being a colonist in those years. You are a farmer in Pennsylvania or a trader in Virginia. Rumors spread quickly. French forts rising in the west. Native allies of the French striking at frontier settlements. British soldiers marching through your towns. The war was not distant. It touched daily life, sometimes in terrifying ways. Families on the edges of settlement lived in constant fear of raids. Frontier cabins stood as fragile defenses against forces far beyond their control. For many colonists, this war was the first time they saw the scale of imperial power. British redcoats, with their bright uniforms and strict discipline, marched through colonial towns. Ships filled with soldiers and supplies crowded into colonial harbors. Taxes were raised to fund the war effort, and supplies were demanded from colonial farms and merchants. To some, this was a moment of pride, a reminder that they were part of the mightiest empire in the world. To others, it was a burden, a reminder that their lives could be disrupted for conflicts decided far away in London or Paris. The war itself was long and brutal. Early on, the French and their native allies scored victories, striking fear into the colonies. British forts fell, and settlers were pushed back. But over time, with more resources and soldiers, Britain began to turn the tide. In 1759, the capture of Quebec marked a decisive moment. By 1763, the Treaty of Paris ended the war, leaving Britain in control of nearly all French territories in North America. At first glance, this seemed like a triumph. The French threat was gone. The colonies were safer, but victory came with a cost. The war had been enormously expensive. Britain had poured money into defending the colonies, and now the empire was in debt. To London, it seemed only fair that the colonies should help pay for their own protection. To the colonists, who had already given lives and resources, it felt like an unfair demand. This tension soon grew sharper. After the war, Britain issued the Proclamation of 1763, which forbade colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. The Crown hoped to stabilize relations with native tribes by controlling expansion. But for colonists, many of whom had dreamed of moving westward to claim new land, it felt like a betrayal. They had fought, sacrificed, and endured for the right to expand, only to be told they could not. Meanwhile, taxes began to appear in new forms. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and other measures required colonists to pay directly to the Crown. To British officials, this was practical governance. To colonists, it was a shocking intrusion. They had long been used to a degree of independence, running their local assemblies and deciding many matters for themselves. Suddenly, London was reaching across the ocean, demanding not just loyalty, but money. Imagine the conversations in taverns and meeting houses during these years. Farmers, merchants, ministers, and sailors gathered by candlelight, their voices low but passionate. Words like liberty and rights began to appear more often. Pamphlets were passed from hand to hand, carrying arguments that ordinary people could understand. That taxation without representation was unfair, that the colonies were not children to be ordered about, that they had a voice and it deserved to be heard. Yet it is important to remember, the colonies of the 1760s were not yet calling for independence. Most still saw themselves as loyal subjects of the king. They sang songs about England, toasted the crown, and celebrated British victories. But in their hearts, something was shifting. The war had shown them their own strength, the militias they raised, the communities they defended, and the restrictions that followed had shown them their own vulnerability, the limits of their freedom under imperial rule. Daily life during this time was a strange mixture of normalcy and growing unrest. Children still played in village streets, women still baked bread and spun cloth, men still tilled fields and hammered iron in workshops. Ships still came and went, markets still bustled, weddings were still celebrated. But woven into these ordinary rhythms was a new kind of unease. Every new tax notice, every British soldier stationed in a town, every rumor of further restrictions was like a small stone dropped into water, sending ripples outward. For enslaved people in the South, and for free black communities in the North, these debates about liberty and rights carried an even sharper irony. They heard white colonists speak passionately about freedom from British control, even as many of those same colonists held others in chains. This contradiction would remain unresolved for generations, but even then, whispers of it echoed quietly in sermons, in letters, in the hopes of those who dreamed of true liberty. The 1760s were a decade of simmering tension, not open rebellion. But history teaches us that revolutions are not born in a single moment. They are built slowly, in the quiet years when ideas begin to spread, when frustrations build, when ordinary people begin to see themselves differently. The French and Indian War had removed one empire's shadow from the colonies, but it had cast a new one, the shadow of Britain itself, stretching longer and heavier over the lives of colonists who increasingly felt They were something more than mere subjects. If you close your eyes and picture a New England town in 1765, you would see cobblestone streets, carts filled with goods, the church bell ringing on a Sunday morning. But if you listened closely, you might hear something new in the voices around you. A printer might be reading aloud the words of a pamphlet, challenging Parliament's right to tax them. A farmer might mutter about the unfairness of being kept from new land to the west. A merchant might worry about how restrictions hurt his trade. These were not yet cries for revolution, but they were questions. Questions that would, in time, grow too loud to ignore. And so the colonies carried on, caught between two identities, still tied to Britain, yet slowly discovering themselves as something separate. The French and Indian War had been fought and won, but its aftermath left behind a legacy more powerful than any battlefield. It had planted the seeds of independence, not yet visible, not yet certain, but quietly taking root in the minds of ordinary men and women who, without realizing it, were walking steadily toward a revolution. As the years moved further into the 18th century, the scattered colonies along the Atlantic seaboard began to feel less like fragile outposts and more like permanent societies, slowly knitting themselves into a fabric that looked less temporary with each passing decade. Small villages had grown into towns, and some towns were beginning to resemble cities with crowded wharves, busy marketplaces, and the hum of workshops that never seemed to rest. Life still remained simple compared to what lay across the ocean in London, Paris, or Amsterdam, but it was no longer just survival. There was the faint shape of prosperity, and for those who had once lived through the thin winters of Jamestown or the fragile beginnings of Plymouth, this stage of life in the colonies must have felt almost secure. Yet it was still the 18th century in a land far away from Europe. And that meant nothing was ever fully certain. The New England colonies, with their rocky soil and shorter growing seasons, had shifted much of their energy toward the sea. Their coastlines were alive with fishing boats, whaling vessels, and merchant ships that carried salted cod and timber to distant ports. Harbors like Boston grew in importance, and the rhythm of the tide became the rhythm of commerce. In the mornings, fishermen hauled their catch ashore, and barrels of cod filled storehouses that smelled of salt and wood smoke. Shipbuilders hammered planks into hulls, the sound echoing across the bay, and sails snapped in the wind as new vessels prepared for trade. This was no longer just subsistence living. It was industry, fragile but real. Farther south, in the middle colonies, life carried a different rhythm. The land there was fertile, the soil darker and kinder, and wheat became the treasure that shaped their identity. Rolling fields stretched across Pennsylvania and New York, dotted with farmhouses and barns. Families rose before dawn, the men guiding plows while women tended gardens and preserved food for the winter. Children learned to milk cows and gather eggs, their days filled with chores that left little time for idleness. Yet the abundance of grain turned the region into a breadbasket, not only for the colonies but for distant markets as well. Ships laden with flour sailed down rivers and out into the Atlantic, carrying the quiet work of thousands of ordinary farmers into the wider world. In the southern colonies, another story unfolded, one bound tightly to the rhythms of plantation life. Tobacco fields stretched into the horizon of Virginia and Maryland, their rows neat and endless. In South Carolina, rice paddies glistened under the sun, and indigo plants grew in neat lines. These crops demanded labor, back-breaking labor, and that demand gave rise to one of the darkest realities of the colonial era, the expansion of slavery. Ships from Africa arrived at southern ports, and the people who disembarked were forced into lives not of their choosing. On plantations, enslaved men and women bent under the sun, their hands planting, cutting, and harvesting in endless repetition. Their voices, their stories, and their grief became woven into the land, even as the wealth they created enriched others. It was an unspoken truth, often ignored in polite conversation, but it was always present, shaping society in ways that would linger for centuries. Daily life in the colonies, whether north or south, was a mixture of hardship and small joys. Homes were still simple, often made of wood, their interiors warmed by a single hearth. Families gathered around firelight in the evenings, the flickering glow illuminating tired faces as meals of bread, porridge, or salted meat were shared. Candles burned low as parents told children stories or read aloud from a Bible worn by many hands. On Sundays, church bells called entire towns together, and though beliefs varied between regions, Puritans in New England, Quakers in Pennsylvania, Anglicans in Virginia, faith gave structure to the passing weeks. It offered reassurance, a sense that their struggles had meaning, even if the meaning was not always clear. Education, too, began to take root in ways that would shape the future. In New England, towns established small schools where children learned letters, numbers, and scripture. In some households, mothers or fathers taught children at home, scratching letters into wooden tablets or tracing them into the dust. Books were still precious objects, but more families acquired them, passing them down like heirlooms. In the middle colonies, a variety of cultural influences, Dutch, German, English, Swedish, created diverse traditions of schooling and craft. Each group left its mark, blending languages, recipes, and customs into something distinctly colonial. And while the South lagged behind in formal education, with vast distances and plantations keeping communities scattered, private tutors occasionally served the wealthier families. Slowly, knowledge spread, not evenly, but steadily enough to spark curiosity in young minds who would one day inherit the shaping of a nation. Communication between colonies was never simple. Roads were rough, and often little more than paths carved through forests. Travelers on horseback or in wagons jolted along, enduring mud in the spring and dust in the summer. A letter sent from Boston to Charleston might take weeks, sometimes months, to arrive. News was often old by the time it reached distant ears, yet word still traveled. Pamphlets, sermons, and tavern conversations became the threads of a collective awareness. And though the colonies were different in climate, culture, and economy, they were gradually tied together by shared experience. Taverns, in particular, became important gathering places. By day, they served as inns for weary travelers. By night, they transformed into centers of conversation, where men debated politics, traded gossip, and speculated on distant wars. The air filled with the scent of ale and smoke, the murmur of voices rising and falling like the tide. Sometimes arguments flared, and sometimes agreements were struck, but always there was talk. In an era before instant communication, these moments mattered. They carried ideas across regions, planting seeds that would later grow into something larger. While adults labored and worried, children grew up surrounded by both hardship and wonder. They played simple games, rolling hoops or tossing stones, their laughter cutting through the seriousness of daily life. In rural areas, they wandered fields and forests, chasing after fireflies or gathering berries in the summer. In coastal towns, they watched ships depart and return, imagining faraway lands they might never see. Their childhoods were shorter than what we think of today, for responsibility came early. But even in a world of labor, small moments of joy endured, preserved in memory as a kind of quiet treasure. The 18th century also brought the colonies into the shadow of empire. Across the Atlantic, European nations fought wars that spilled over into North America. Colonists who had once seen themselves as distant from Old World struggles began to feel their effects. Soldiers marched through towns, taxes were levied, and alliances were demanded. The French, the British, the Spanish, all maneuvered for control of territory, while Native American nations, still powerful and resilient, negotiated, resisted, and fought to preserve their homelands. For ordinary settlers, these conflicts often meant disruption. Crops trampled, homes abandoned, lives uprooted. Yet history has a way of pressing ordinary people into larger stories, whether they wish it or not. And so, as the 1700s unfolded, the colonies stood at a threshold. They were not yet the United States, not yet a unified identity. They were still English, Dutch, German, African, Irish, and more, bound together loosely by geography and necessity. Their lives were filled with labor and uncertainty, but also with a steady growth, a quiet resilience that made survival not only possible but sustainable. When they looked ahead, they could not see what was coming, nor did they imagine the sweeping changes that lay just decades away. They were simply living, building homes, raising children, working fields, crafting ships, worshiping on Sundays, and finding meaning in small, everyday acts. And in that quiet persistence, the foundation of something far greater was laid, though none of them could yet name it. The middle of the 18th century carried with it a sense of slow momentum, as though the colonies were walking forward without quite knowing where the path might lead. Families were planting crops, building homes, and trying to hold their lives steady. But history has a way of arriving uninvited. In 1754, the colonies found themselves pulled into a conflict that was not of their own making. A conflict born in Europe, but played out in the forests and rivers of North America. It would be known as the French and Indian War, part of the larger struggle between Britain and France, two empires locked in a contest for land, resources, and influence. For the people who lived in the colonies, this war was not a distant affair. It was fought in their fields, across their hunting grounds, and along the same rivers that had carried their trade. To understand how it began, one has to imagine the geography of North America at the time. Britain held its 13 colonies stretched along the Atlantic coast, while France laid claim to the vast interior, a web of forts and trading posts reaching from Canada down the Mississippi River to Louisiana. In between were Native American nations, still powerful and still navigating the shifting balance of European rivalry. For the French, alliances with native peoples were essential. Traders from Quebec or Montreal carried furs and gifts into the wilderness, forging bonds with the Huron, the Algonquin, and many others. The British, pushing steadily westward, came into contact and conflict with tribes like the Shawnee, Delaware, and especially the Iroquois, whose league had long commanded respect. In the Ohio River Valley, fertile and promising, these competing interests clashed. French soldiers built forts to secure their claims. British settlers, encouraged by land companies and hungry for new farmland, began moving into the same territory. Native communities, caught in the middle, chose sides carefully, weighing promises and threats. In this tinderbox, the spark came when a young British officer named George Washington, unknown then but destined for future fame, led an expedition to challenge French positions. His skirmish with a small French force in 1754, clumsy and uncertain, set in motion a war that neither side had fully prepared for. The war quickly spread, and for ordinary colonists, its arrival meant sudden disruption. Farmers abandoned fields as rumors of raids swept through frontier towns. Families huddled in wooden forts hastily built for protection, listening to the night for sounds of movement in the dark forests beyond. Soldiers marched through villages, red coats bright against the green wilderness, their muskets gleaming in the sun. For many, it was the first time they had seen the full machinery of empire. Disciplined ranks, booming cannons, and the relentless orders of officers who spoke in accents from across the sea. The fighting itself was unlike the wars of Europe. Here, in the deep woods and along winding rivers, traditional battle lines broke apart. Ambushes, raids, and sudden strikes defined much of the conflict. Native warriors, skilled in moving silently through forests, struck settlements and forts with terrifying precision. Colonists lived in constant tension, their days filled with work, but their nights haunted by fear. A man might rise before dawn to cut hay in a field, scanning the tree line as he swung his scythe, never quite certain if he would return home at dusk. Women kept muskets by the door as they prepared meals, their children learning to stay quiet when strangers passed by. Yet even in such uncertainty, daily life went on. Crops still needed planting, livestock still needed tending. In towns farther from the frontier, markets still bustled, and church bells still rang. But the shadow of war stretched long, reminding everyone that their world was no longer just local. What happened hundreds of miles away in the Ohio Valley or at a distant fort could ripple back into their lives in ways they had never imagined. The British military presence grew heavier as the war dragged on. Regular troops, professional soldiers from England, looked down on colonial militias, often dismissing them as undisciplined and untrained. Colonists, for their part, resented the arrogance of officers who did not understand the land or the hardships of frontier life. They fought together, but uneasily, and in the spaces between battles, these tensions whispered of future conflicts yet to come. Still, many colonists volunteered, driven by loyalty to the crown or simply by the hope of protecting their homes. Young men marched into forests carrying muskets, their faces a mix of fear and determination, while mothers and fathers waited anxiously for their return. The war was not only about territory, it was about survival for native nations as well. For years, they had maneuvered between French and British interests, trying to preserve their own lands and autonomy. Some allied with the French, trusting the promises of traders who came bearing gifts and goodwill. Others sided with the British, calculating that their growing numbers made them the stronger force. Still others tried to remain neutral, only to be drawn in by necessity. Their choices were not made lightly, for every decision carried consequences that would echo for generations. When villages were burned or allies betrayed, the wounds cut deep. To many native communities, the war was not simply a European struggle. It was another chapter in the long defense of their homelands. The conflict stretched on for years, consuming lives and resources. Battles raged at Fort Duquesne, Fort Ticonderoga, and along the St. Lawrence River. Rivers that had once carried trade now carried armies. The air filled with smoke, gunpowder, and the cries of men locked in desperate struggle. Colonists read accounts of victories and defeats in pamphlets, listening as ministers wove the news into sermons about God's will and the fate of their communities. Every piece of news was personal. A cousin missing in the militia, a neighbor's son killed in a skirmish, a family forced to abandon their farm. By 1763, the war drew to its conclusion with the Treaty of Paris. Britain emerged victorious, gaining vast territories once held by France, including Canada, and lands east of the Mississippi River. To many colonists, it seemed like the dawn of a new era. The French threat had been removed, and with it, the constant fear of invasion from the north and west. Yet the victory brought its own complications. With France gone, native nations found themselves more directly in conflict with British settlers pushing ever westward. The fragile balance of power had been shattered, and in the years to come, new uprisings and new struggles would emerge. For the colonists, too, the end of the war was not the end of their difficulties. Britain, burdened by the enormous cost of the conflict, turned to the colonies for revenue. Taxes, regulations, and restrictions soon followed, laying the groundwork for the discontent that would eventually lead to revolution. But in 1763, standing at the edge of peace, most colonists could not yet see what lay ahead. They were simply weary of war, longing for the return of ordinary days, fields to plow, ships to build, children to raise. In the quiet after the war, life resumed its rhythm. Farmers sowed seeds again in fields left untended. Merchants reopened shops, their goods once more filling shelves. Families repaired homes damaged in raids. Yet beneath this calm was a subtle shift, a sense that something had changed. Colonists who had once thought of themselves simply as subjects of the crown had seen firsthand the arrogance of British officers, the indifference of distant rulers, and the high cost of loyalty. They did not yet dream of independence, but the idea had begun to take root, silent and slow, like seeds hidden beneath the soil. And so the French and Indian War ended not just with treaties and maps redrawn, but with memories etched deeply into those who lived through it. Memories of fear, of hardship, of courage, and of loss. Memories that would shape how they saw themselves in the years to come. For history does not announce its turning points as they happen. It whispers them into the lives of ordinary people, who only later realize that everything has quietly begun to change. The war had ended, but peace in the colonies did not arrive in the way people had hoped. In 1763, with the Treaty of Paris signed, Britain stood triumphant. The French threat was gone. Canada now bore the Union Jack, and vast lands stretching to the Mississippi seemed open for British settlers. Colonists looked westward with hungry eyes, imagining fertile farms and fresh starts for their children. Yet almost immediately, reality proved harsher than dreams. Britain's victory had come at an enormous price, and those costs would ripple across the Atlantic, altering the relationship between the colonies and their mother country in ways that few could yet understand. The first signs of change came in the form of restrictions. The Proclamation of 1763 declared that colonists could not settle beyond the Appalachian Mountains. For families who had already packed wagons and prepared to move west, the announcement felt like a betrayal. They had fought and bled during the French and Indian War, endured the loss of kin and the ruin of farms, only to be told that the rich lands of the Ohio Valley were forbidden to them. Britain claimed the restriction was meant to prevent further conflict with native nations, who were understandably angered by the encroachment on their lands. To many colonists, however, it felt like control, an invisible line drawn across the wilderness, cutting short their hopes for expansion. At the same time, British officials in London confronted a staggering reality. The war had left the empire deeply in debt, and maintaining garrisons in North America to secure the newly won territory added to the financial strain. Parliament, looking across the ocean at colonies they believed were prospering, decided that the burden of empire should be shared. Taxes and duties would be levied, not only to help repay debts, but also to remind the colonies of their place within Britain's system of authority. For colonists, who had long enjoyed a degree of independence in local affairs, the shift was jarring. In 1764 came the Sugar Act, imposing duties on molasses and other imports. Merchants in Boston, New York, and Philadelphia muttered in frustration, their profits suddenly thinner, their trade less free. Smugglers who had quietly skirted regulations now faced stricter enforcement. Whispers filled taverns and meeting houses. If Parliament could tax sugar, what else might it claim the right to tax? The following year, the Stamp Act of 1765 pushed discontent into something louder. Suddenly, every piece of paper, newspapers, legal documents, contracts, even playing cards, was required to bear a stamp, purchased from the Crown. It was not merely an economic burden, it was a symbolic one. For the first time, Parliament had imposed a direct tax on the colonies without their consent. Lawyers, printers, shopkeepers, and ordinary townsfolk felt its weight. Newspapers published angry essays, arguing that freeborn Englishmen should not be taxed without representation in the government that taxed them. The phrase began to circulate like wildfire. No taxation without representation. Across the colonies, protests erupted. In Boston, effigies of tax collectors were hung and burned. Crowds gathered in the streets, shouting against the injustice, their voices carrying far into the night. In Virginia, the House of Burgesses passed resolutions declaring that only their own assembly had the right to tax Virginians. Patrick Henry, a fiery young lawyer, thundered that Parliament's actions threatened the liberties of the colonies, and though his words were bold, they captured a growing sentiment that echoed far beyond his chamber. Ordinary people felt the unrest in their daily lives. A printer in Philadelphia might hesitate before running a newspaper, the cost of stamps eating away at his livelihood. A farmer in New England, listening to talk in the local tavern, might wonder whether his modest life was now entangled with the ambitions of distant kings and ministers. A merchant in New York might find himself caught between obeying the law and joining neighbors in boycotting British goods. These were not abstract debates for them. They were decisions about survival, loyalty, and identity. Resistance took many forms. The Sons of Liberty, a loose network of colonists opposed to British taxation, organized demonstrations and sometimes violent intimidation of tax officials. Stamp distributors, facing angry mobs at their doors, resigned their positions in droves. In towns and villages, ordinary men and women began to make do without imported British goods, wearing homespun cloth and finding pride in self-reliance. The act of drinking tea, or refusing it, took on new meaning, each cup a quiet act of loyalty or defiance. Though protests were sometimes chaotic, they were also remarkably organized. Colonial assemblies sent petitions to London declaring their loyalty to the Crown while firmly rejecting Parliament's right to tax them. In 1765, representatives from 9 colonies met in New York at what became known as the Stamp Act Congress, a rare moment of unity across regions that often saw themselves as very different. They argued not for rebellion, not yet, but for recognition of rights they believed they already held as English subjects. It was a cautious but significant step, one that revealed how common grievances could draw the colonies together. Britain, surprised by the depth of resistance, repealed the Stamp Act in 1766. Church bells rang, crowds cheered, and bonfires burned in celebration. For a moment it seemed as though the colonies had won. Yet the repeal was accompanied by the Declaratory Act, which quietly asserted that Parliament retained the full right to legislate for the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Few paid attention to its wording at the time, but in hindsight, it was a warning of struggles yet to come. Relief was short-lived. Within a year, new taxes arrived in the form of the Townshend Acts, placing duties on glass, paper, paint, and tea. Colonists, who had only just tasted victory, found themselves again pressed by regulations. Boycotts flared once more. Women gathered to spin their own cloth rather than purchase British textiles, and merchants pledged not to import certain goods. Newspapers carried biting satire and serious argument, weaving a growing sense of defiance into the fabric of daily life. For ordinary families, the unrest was both distant and close. A farmer in Maryland might still rise at dawn, tend his fields, and gather with neighbors on Sundays without seeing a single soldier. Yet, when he purchased a newspaper or a spool of thread, he felt the tension in the price and the talk that surrounded it. A dock worker in Boston, unloading cargo, might hear debates between sailors about boycotts and loyalty. A housewife in Connecticut might sit by candlelight, sewing clothes for her children, her hands working steadily as her mind turned over the question of what it meant to live freely. Through it all, loyalty to Britain remained strong for many. Colonists were proud to be part of the British Empire, to share in its traditions, its culture, its history. They celebrated victories in Europe, read English literature, and saw themselves as heirs to the rights of Magna Carta. The unrest did not yet mean disloyalty. It meant a demand to be recognized as equals, not subordinates. But the longer the misunderstandings continued, the harder it became to maintain that balance. By the late 1760s, a quiet transformation was underway. Colonists were beginning to see themselves not only as Virginians, or Pennsylvanians, or Bostonians, but as something larger. Their shared frustrations were weaving connections across regions that had once seemed worlds apart. They were still farmers, fishermen, merchants, and craftsmen, but they were also slowly becoming something more. A people conscious of their rights, their dignity, and their ability to act together. They did not yet know where this path would lead. They did not imagine declarations of independence or the clash of armies. For now, they wanted fairness, representation, and the freedom to live their lives without distant interference. But history was moving, quietly and steadily. And in the streets of Boston, the fields of Virginia, and the taverns of Philadelphia, the first murmurs of revolution were already being spoken. By the early 1770s, the tension between the American colonies and Britain had shifted from a low murmur into something far more urgent. The debates over taxes and representation had not faded. They had deepened, drawing ordinary men and women into conversations that just a decade earlier would have seemed unthinkable. What had once been loyalty mixed with irritation was beginning to harden into something else. A sense of injustice, and for some, a dawning awareness that the bond with Britain might not be as unshakable as they once believed. Daily life in the colonies still followed familiar rhythms. Farmers rose with the sun to work their fields, fishermen cast their nets into the Atlantic, shopkeepers opened their shutters to the streets, and children played in dusty lanes. Yet beneath these ordinary tasks, people were speaking with a new intensity. In taverns, in churches, in marketplaces, they asked each other whether the taxes, restrictions, and presence of British troops were simply the price of empire, or whether they were signs that their liberties were being slowly taken away. The Townshend Acts of the late 1760s had already stirred protests and boycotts. Colonists refused British goods. Women spun their own cloth in what became known as spinning bees, and merchants pledged not to import taxed items. This collective defiance was powerful, but it also provoked the Crown. To enforce order, Britain sent more troops into Boston, a city already alive with political fervor. The arrival of red-coated soldiers in 1768 changed the atmosphere of the town. Soldiers drilled in the streets, muskets on their shoulders, their bright uniforms clashing against the weathered wooden houses and narrow alleys. To some Bostonians, the troops were a visible reminder that they were subjects under watch. Living side by side with soldiers created constant friction. Off-duty men mingled in taverns, competed for work with local laborers, and clashed in arguments that sometimes spilled into the streets. Children mocked them, calling out insults, while women cast uneasy glances as patrols marched past their doors. The tension could not last forever, and on a cold night in March 1770, it reached its breaking point. That evening, a crowd gathered near the Customs House, angry and restless. Snowballs, some packed with ice or stones, were hurled at a small group of British soldiers standing guard. Voices rose, daring the soldiers to fire. In the confusion, no one knows exactly who gave the order, or if any order was given at all, but suddenly muskets cracked. Smoke filled the air, and when it cleared, several colonists lay on the ground, blood staining the snow. Among the dead was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and native descent, remembered as the first to fall. News of what came to be called the Boston Massacre spread quickly. In taverns and meeting houses, it was told and retold, each version sharper than the last. Pamphlets painted the event as a brutal slaughter of innocent men, though others argued it had been a chaotic clash fueled by anger on both sides. In court, John Adams, a respected lawyer, defended the soldiers, insisting that justice required fairness even for those seen as enemies. His defense saved most of them from harsh punishment, but the memory of the night remained. For many colonists, the sight of British muskets turned on their neighbors was a wound that would not heal. The years that followed did not ease the strain. Though some taxes were repealed, Parliament kept a duty on tea as a symbol of its right to govern the colonies. For Britain, it was a matter of principle. For the colonists, it was a constant reminder of subordination. Tea was not just a drink, it was a part of daily life. Families sipped it by candlelight, merchants sold it by the chest, and women brewed it in kitchens from New England to the Carolinas. To tax such a staple was to intrude into every home. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, designed to rescue the struggling British East India Company by allowing it to sell tea directly to the colonies at a reduced price, but still taxed. On the surface, it seemed like a bargain. In reality, it was seen as a trick, a way to tempt colonists into accepting Parliament's authority. The reaction was swift. In towns across the colonies, meetings were held. Some ports refused to allow tea ships to unload, their harbors filled with vessels that became symbols of defiance. In Boston, the standoff reached its dramatic climax. On a cold December night in 1773, a group of men disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded ships anchored in the harbor. They worked methodically, breaking open chests and pouring the tea into the dark water below. The harbor was said to smell of tea for days, the water stained with leaves that drifted out to sea. The Boston Tea Party, as it came to be known, was not an act of violence, but one of symbolism, a public rejection of Britain's authority. For many, it was exhilarating. For Britain, it was intolerable. The response came in the form of what colonists would call the coercive acts, and Britain would call the intolerable acts. Passed in 1774, they were meant to punish Massachusetts and reassert control. The port of Boston was closed until the destroyed tea was paid for, choking the city's trade. Town meetings were restricted, colonial assemblies weakened, and more soldiers were quartered among the population. To the people of Massachusetts, it felt like collective punishment. To other colonies, it was a warning of what might happen to them if they, too, defied London. What surprised Britain, and perhaps even the colonists themselves, was the way the punishment of Massachusetts inspired solidarity rather than submission. Food and supplies poured into Boston from other colonies, carried by wagon and ship. Towns hundreds of miles away held meetings, passed resolutions, and pledged support. For the first time, the struggles of one colony were seen as the struggles of all. In 1774, delegates from 12 colonies gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. Men who had never met before sat in the same room, debating, arguing, and searching for common ground. They were cautious, not ready to break with Britain, but they spoke with a clarity that had been absent before. They called for a boycott of British goods, urged unity, and insisted on their rights as Englishmen. The idea of an American identity, once distant and abstract, was beginning to take form. Meanwhile, in homes and villages, ordinary people felt the change in ways both subtle and profound. A farmer in Virginia might wear homespun cloth, not just from necessity, but from pride. A housewife in Pennsylvania might teach her children that refusing British tea was as important as attending church on Sunday. A blacksmith in New England, hammering iron in his forge, might find himself making nails for new meeting houses where political debates burned late into the night. The conflict with Britain was no longer just about laws and taxes. It was about how people lived, what they valued, and what they believed they deserved. And always, the presence of British soldiers was a reminder of the growing divide. Redcoats marched in towns, drilled in fields, and quartered in homes, their very presence a spark for resentment. To some colonists, they were protectors, a shield against chaos. To others, they were occupiers, a living symbol of a government that no longer understood or respected them. By the close of 1774, the colonies stood on the edge of something uncertain. Few yet spoke openly of independence, but the idea of reconciliation seemed increasingly fragile. In Boston, ships no longer filled the harbor with goods, but with tension. In the countryside, militias drilled quietly, muskets polished, powder stored. In taverns, debates grew sharper. The words of pamphlets passed hand to hand. And in the hearts of many, a question took shape. One that had no easy answer. If Britain would not recognize their rights, what choice remained? The colonies were still bound to the empire, but the rope was fraying. What had begun with taxes and protests had grown into a struggle over identity, liberty, and the meaning of loyalty. The stage was set, though few could see how soon it would unfold into open conflict. For now, there was silence before the storm, a silence filled with restless energy. Families still worked their fields, ships still sailed the Atlantic, bells still rang on Sundays, but beneath it all, the sound of history gathering force could almost be heard, waiting for the moment when everything would break. By the opening months of 1775, the colonies stood balanced on a knife's edge. The events of the past decade, the taxes, the protests, the massacre in Boston, the Tea Party, the harsh punishments had driven a wedge so deep between Britain and its American colonies that even cautious voices could not deny how fragile reconciliation had become. In taverns, in farmhouses, in meeting halls, people spoke more openly now. Was it truly possible to remain subjects of a king who seemed deaf to their petitions? Or was the time approaching when they would need to take up arms, not merely words? The British government had made its intentions clear through the Intolerable Acts. They sought to isolate Massachusetts, to make an example of Boston so that other colonies would hesitate before challenging authority. Instead, the opposite had occurred. Colonies that had once acted alone now reached out to each other. Aid flowed into Boston from as far as South Carolina. Farmers sent food, merchants shipped supplies, and committees of correspondence spread news quickly, binding distant communities into something resembling unity. In Philadelphia, the First Continental Congress had already planted the seeds of coordinated resistance. Delegates had called for a boycott of British goods and had urged colonies to prepare themselves, though not yet for open war. Still, whispers of armed conflict had begun to circulate. Across New England, men gathered in fields and barns to drill with muskets. They were called Minutemen, ordinary farmers and tradesmen who pledged to be ready at a moment's notice. The sight of them practicing maneuvers in village greens, their muskets glinting in the sun, was both a warning and a promise. The colonies would not submit quietly. For General Thomas Gage, the British commander in Boston, the situation was intolerable. He had thousands of troops under his command, yet they seemed penned in by the hostility of the population surrounding them. Outside the city, militias stockpiled weapons and powder in hidden barns, in cellars, and in small towns like Concord, just a day's march inland. Gage received orders from London to act decisively. Disarm the colonists, arrest their leaders if necessary, and restore order. The night of April 18, 1775, was clear and cool. British regulars prepared to march out of Boston, their mission secret, but their presence hard to disguise. Across the water, riders waited, watching for signals. In the Old North Church, lanterns glowed briefly. 2 lights, the signal agreed upon by patriots. The British were moving by sea. Horsemen leapt into their saddles and galloped into the countryside, crying out warnings. "The regulars are coming out!" One rider, Paul Revere, became famous in memory. Though many others carried the alarm that night, their hooves striking sparks on cobblestone and dirt roads as they spread the word. Farmers awoke from sleep, lit lanterns, and reached for muskets that had hung above fireplaces for years. In Lexington, a small band of Minutemen gathered on the village green in the pre-dawn darkness, their breath visible in the cold air. They were not professional soldiers. They were fathers, sons, neighbors, men who had never thought themselves warriors. Yet they stood waiting, uncertain but resolved, when the red-coated soldiers approached. What happened next has been debated ever since. A shot rang out. No one knows from which side. In the chaos, The British fired a volley, and when the smoke cleared, several colonists lay dead or wounded. The British pushed on toward Concord, but the countryside was no longer silent. Bells tolled in distant villages, muskets cracked from behind stone walls and trees, and militias swarmed the roads. At Concord's North Bridge, colonists met the British with fire of their own, driving them back in confusion. As the Redcoats retreated toward Boston, the road became a gauntlet. Farmers and shopkeepers firing from behind fences and hedges turned the retreat into a running battle. By the time the exhausted British reached the safety of the city, hundreds had been killed or wounded on both sides. The shot heard round the world, as poets would later call it, had been fired. The war that so many had feared, and others had anticipated, was no longer a distant possibility. It was real, bloody, and immediate. News spread like wildfire. By the time riders carried the story southward, villages and towns across the colonies knew that blood had been spilled. In Virginia, Patrick Henry rose in a crowded assembly and declared words that echoed through history. "Give me liberty, or give me death." The call was not merely rhetoric. It was a stark recognition that the struggle had entered a new phase. In the weeks that followed, militias from across New England surrounded Boston, laying siege to the city. Thousands of colonial fighters camped in makeshift encampments, their muskets pointed toward British lines. Inside the city, Redcoats and Loyalist families endured shortages, tensions, and fear. The once bustling port now felt like a fortress, its harbor patrolled by the Royal Navy, its streets watched carefully by soldiers. In June 1775, the tension erupted again at the Battle of Bunker Hill. Colonial forces, warned that the British planned to break the siege, fortified positions on the heights overlooking Boston. Though often remembered as the Battle of Bunker Hill, most of the fighting occurred on Breed's Hill. When British troops advanced in rigid lines, the colonists held their fire until the enemy was close. So close that, according to legend, they were told, "Don't fire until you see the whites of their eyes." The British charged again and again, and though the colonists eventually ran out of powder and were forced to retreat, the cost was staggering for the Redcoats. Over 1,000 British soldiers were killed or wounded. Though technically a British victory, the battle proved a crucial lesson. Colonial fighters, when determined and fortified, could stand against the most powerful army in the world. Word of the bravery at Breed's Hill spread through the colonies, inspiring resolve. Farmers and shopkeepers, blacksmiths and fishermen, all saw that their resistance was not futile. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, the Second Continental Congress convened. Delegates from all 13 colonies now gathered, the atmosphere far more urgent than it had been the year before. They faced impossible questions. Should they reconcile, or should they prepare for a wider war? Voices differed. Some urged caution, still hoping that a final petition to the king might avert catastrophe. Others, hardened by the bloodshed in Massachusetts, spoke of independence more openly. One of their first acts was to appoint a commander-in-chief for the colonial forces. Their choice was George Washington, a tall Virginian with a reputation for steady leadership. Washington accepted with solemnity, aware of the immense burden before him. He traveled north to take command of the ragtag army besieging Boston, men who brought with them not just muskets, but also the hopes of a people who longed for dignity and liberty. Even as muskets cracked and armies formed, many colonists still clung to hope for reconciliation. Congress sent the Olive Branch petition to King George III in a final attempt to declare loyalty while asking for redress of grievances. The king's response, however, was swift and dismissive. He refused to even receive the petition and instead declared the colonies in open rebellion. For many Americans, that rejection closed the door on compromise. By late 1775, the conflict spread beyond Massachusetts. Skirmishes erupted in Virginia, the Carolinas, and New York. In Quebec, colonial forces attempted an invasion of Canada, hoping to rally French-speaking settlers to their cause, though the campaign faltered. Still, the determination grew. Pamphlets circulated, none more influential than Thomas Paine's Common Sense, published in early 1776. In plain, fiery language, Paine argued that independence was not only possible but necessary. He spoke not of distant parliaments and abstract rights, but of freedom, equality, and the promise of a new kind of nation. His words electrified readers from New England to Georgia, giving voice to feelings that had long simmered unspoken. By the spring of 1776, the colonies were no longer merely resisting British authority. They were imagining a world without it. The conversations in homes and meeting houses shifted from whether they should fight to how they would live once free. Men debated governments and rights. Women considered what liberty might mean for their families, and enslaved people listened carefully, wondering if the talk of freedom might one day reach them as well. The path to independence was not yet declared, but the momentum was unstoppable. The musket fire at Lexington and Concord had begun something larger than anyone could have imagined. Each skirmish, each act of defiance, each fiery speech pushed the colonies further from the empire that had once been their home. The bonds of loyalty had frayed too far to be mended. As the summer of 1776 approached, Congress would gather again in Philadelphia, not to plead for reconciliation, but to declare something unthinkable just a few years before: that the colonies were no longer colonies at all, but states united in pursuit of independence. The question was no longer if they would, but how and when. The war for liberty had begun, and though its outcome was uncertain, one truth was clear. The American Revolution was no longer a dream whispered in taverns. It was alive, burning in the hearts of farmers, merchants, artisans, and leaders alike. A fire that would reshape not only their lives, but the world itself. By the summer of 1776, the momentum for independence had become undeniable. The Second Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia with a renewed sense of purpose. What had started as petitions, boycotts, and armed skirmishes had transformed into something far more profound. A movement that would permanently alter the map, the politics, and the identity of the 13 colonies. Delegates from every region sat together, their expressions a mixture of determination, anxiety, and hope. Every man understood the stakes. To declare independence was to commit not only their personal reputations, but also the lives and livelihoods of countless ordinary people to an uncertain future. Philadelphia was alive with tension and anticipation. Streets that normally carried merchants and wagons now thrummed with political discussion. Citizens lined the sidewalks outside Congress halls, listening to whispers and debates carried through open windows. Paper circulated constantly. Pamphlets, letters, essays, each offering arguments for or against the bold step being considered. Even families in quieter towns far from the city followed the news eagerly, discussing it at hearths and dinner tables. The question on everyone's lips was the same: could they truly break away from the empire that had ruled them for more than a century? Thomas Jefferson, a young Virginian, had been tasked with drafting a formal statement of the colony's intentions. For weeks, he labored over every word, conscious that these sentences would not merely explain grievances, they would define a nation. Jefferson wrote of natural rights, of liberty and equality, of the unalienable rights of life, freedom, and the pursuit of happiness. He cataloged the ways in which King George III had violated the rights of the colonists, from taxation without representation to military occupation and suppression of local governance. The document was more than legal argument. It was a manifesto of identity, a declaration of what it meant to be free. The debates within Congress were intense. Some delegates feared the consequences of open rebellion. They worried about the strength of the British Army, the loyalty of native nations, and the uncertainty of foreign allies. Others argued that the time for caution had passed. Every day of delay allowed the empire to tighten its control, to discourage unity, and to undermine the spirit of liberty that had been building for more than a decade. Finally, after weeks of discussion, revision, and compromise, the Congress voted to approve the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776. The moment was monumental. Bells rang across Philadelphia and Boston, in town squares and village greens, announcing the birth of a nation. Citizens celebrated with parades, music, and speeches, though the joy was tempered by awareness of the immense risks ahead. Ordinary people, the farmers, artisans, merchants, and laborers who had endured taxes, blockades, and battles, understood that this declaration was not just words on parchment. It was a call to defend their homes, their communities, and their vision of a free society. In homes across the colonies, families read aloud from the Declaration. Children listened wide-eyed as parents explained the meaning of independence. Shopkeepers posted copies in windows, and town criers announced the news to those who could not read. Even in more remote areas, news spread quickly via letters, riders, and travelers, reaching settlers in the backcountry. For many, it was a moment of pride and hope, though shadowed by the knowledge that the war was far from over. Military preparations continued alongside political developments. The Continental Army, under George Washington's command, grew more organized. Training intensified, supplies were stockpiled, and fortifications were strengthened. Soldiers came from all walks of life: farmers, blacksmiths, shopkeepers, leaving families behind to face the dangers of winter, the threat of disease, and the ever-present fear of battle. Camps were harsh places. Tents offered little protection against cold rains and biting winds. Food was scarce. Morale fluctuated. Yet in every drill, every march, and every strategy session, the men carried with them a belief in something larger than themselves, the promise of liberty and self-determination. The war itself spread quickly. New York became a major battleground, with British forces landing to challenge colonial control. Battles were fought at Long Island, White Plains, and Harlem Heights. Washington and his generals faced constant challenges, from supply shortages to desertion, but they adapted, learning the strategies of irregular warfare, building alliances, and understanding the terrain in ways that the British did not. Ordinary colonists were affected daily. Homes requisitioned for soldiers, towns occupied, trade disrupted. Yet, the resolve to endure, to resist, and to defend their communities only grew stronger. Meanwhile, stories of heroism and sacrifice circulated widely. Minutemen who had fought at Lexington and Concord were remembered with reverence. Ordinary men who stood at Bunker Hill or in skirmishes across the countryside became symbols of courage. Families who had lost fathers, sons, or brothers to the conflict bore their grief quietly, sustaining communities even as war raged. Women played essential roles, managing farms, running businesses, and sometimes acting as messengers or caregivers in the absence of men. Their contributions, though often unrecorded, were vital to sustaining the revolution. The Declaration of Independence also had profound social and cultural effects. It sparked debates about who truly enjoyed liberty. Discussions emerged in churches, schools, and homes about the rights of different groups: men and women, free and enslaved, indigenous nations, and immigrants. Though the initial focus was on white male colonists, the seeds of broader questions of equality and freedom were planted, echoing silently through society. Foreign attention followed as well. European powers, particularly France, watched the colonies with a mixture of curiosity and opportunity. Diplomatic envoys began discussions that would eventually lead to crucial alliances, providing funding, military support, and legitimacy to the revolutionary cause. The world beyond the Atlantic Ocean began to recognize that these 13 colonies, once considered a distant and rebellious outpost, were serious in their pursuit of independence. Despite optimism and international attention, the reality of war remained stark. Battles continued in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and the southern colonies. Soldiers endured extreme weather, hunger, and disease. Civilians faced shortages and uncertainty, fearing raids, occupation, and destruction of property. Loyalty was tested daily, not just to the revolutionary cause, but to family, neighbors, and personal safety. Every day required courage, resilience, and the willingness to confront the unknown. Yet through these struggles, a sense of identity coalesced. Colonists increasingly saw themselves not as individual communities or colonies, but as part of a collective, united by common ideals, shared risks, and mutual hopes. The language of liberty and independence became part of daily conversation, even among those who had once been loyal to the crown. Ordinary people understood that the revolution was not just for leaders in Philadelphia or Boston, it was for farmers in Virginia, merchants in New York, fishermen in Maine, and artisans in Charleston. Every life touched by conflict became part of the larger narrative. By the end of 1776, the American Revolution had moved from petition to rebellion to an unmistakable declaration. The 13 colonies claimed the right to govern themselves. The path forward would be perilous. The British Empire remained powerful, seasoned in war, and determined to crush rebellion. But the colonies had demonstrated resilience, unity, and a capacity to adapt that few could have predicted. Ordinary citizens, through their courage, labor, and conviction, had turned the abstract principles of liberty into a lived reality, laying the foundations of a new nation. The Declaration of Independence was more than a document. It was a symbol of possibility, a promise of self-determination, and a call to action. In the homes, fields, towns, and cities of the 13 colonies, people read, discussed, and believed. They had taken the first step into a new world, and though the battles ahead would test them in ways unimaginable, they had, in that moment, claimed their place in history. The revolution had begun not just in Congress or on the battlefield, but in the hearts and minds of ordinary people. Men and women who worked, prayed, argued, and hoped. Their lives, full of struggle and perseverance, had converged to create something unprecedented. A nation founded on the idea that liberty was not given, but taken, defended, and nurtured. The world had changed, and the colonies, once loyal subjects of a distant empire, were now the architects of a destiny they would shape with their own hands, their own courage, and their unwavering belief in freedom.